One lonely cowboy returned home expecting silence, but found an Apache woman washing dishes in his kitchen. Why was she there? What secret changed his heart forever? This touching Wild West story is filled with kindness, trust, and unexpected friendship. Watch till the end for an unforgettable ending, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and press the bell icon for more heartwarming Wild West stories. Montana Territory, USA, 1886. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountains as Jacob Walker guided his tired horse toward his lonely cabin. For 3 long days he had been driving cattle across rough trails, sleeping under the open sky, surviving on dry biscuits and black coffee. Dust covered his coat, his boots were worn, and every muscle in his body ached from the difficult journey. The only thing he wanted was a quiet evening, a simple meal, and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep before another demanding day on the ranch. He expected the cabin to be exactly as he had left it, cold, silent, and covered in dust. As Jacob reached the porch, something immediately felt unusual. His horse lifted its head and sniffed the air instead of walking toward the stable. A pleasant smell drifted from the cabin, one he had not enjoyed in months. It was the rich aroma of freshly baked cornbread mixed with slow-cooked venison stew. Jacob frowned in confusion because no one had a key to his cabin. He lived alone, and the nearest neighbor was nearly half a mile away. His instincts told him that someone had entered his home while he was gone. Quietly, he loosened the revolver in its holster and stepped toward the front door. Jacob slowly pushed the wooden door open, careful not to make a sound. The familiar cabin looked completely different from the place he had left behind. The floor had been swept clean, blankets were neatly folded, and fresh water filled the bucket beside the fireplace. The dusty windows had been wiped until sunlight poured through the glass. But what truly stopped him in his tracks was the sight in the kitchen. An Apache woman stood at the sink, calmly washing his dirty dishes. She worked with quiet confidence, as though she had been part of the cabin for years instead of only a few hours. Jacob's heart pounded as his hand wrapped tightly around the grip of his revolver. Countless stories told by ranchers and travelers rushed through his mind, warning him never to trust anyone from the Apache settlements. His voice echoed through the cabin with sharp authority. "Why are you here?" he demanded. The woman did not scream or reach for a weapon. She simply placed the last plate on the wooden shelf, dried her hands with a clean cloth, and turned toward him. Her calm expression carried neither fear nor anger. Instead, she looked at him with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had done nothing wrong. The woman met his eyes and answered in a gentle voice, "Because your neighbor, Mrs. Harper, said you hadn't eaten properly in days." Her words surprised Jacob far more than her presence. She explained that Mrs. Harper had noticed how exhausted he looked before leaving with the cattle and worried that he would return to an empty cabin without enough strength to care for himself. Rather than ignoring the old woman's concerns, the Apache widow had volunteered to help. She introduced herself as Ayanna and politely stepped aside from the kitchen table where a warm meal waited beneath a clean cloth. Jacob looked around the room, noticing details he had missed in his shock. His scattered clothes had been folded and placed on a wooden chair. Firewood had been stacked neatly beside the fireplace. Even the cracked window had been covered with fresh cloth to keep out the evening wind. On the table rested a loaf of warm cornbread, a bowl of steaming venison stew, and fresh herbs gathered from the nearby hills. Nothing had been stolen. Instead, everything in the cabin had been cared for with remarkable patience. Jacob had never expected to find such kindness waiting for him after days of lonely travel. Ayanna quietly explained that she lived in a small Apache settlement several miles away. She had lost her husband years earlier during a violent conflict and now spent much of her time helping families, elderly neighbors, and travelers who needed assistance. She believed that kindness created stronger bridges than fear ever could. Mrs. Harper had often traded vegetables and sewing supplies with her, and over time the two women had become trusted friends despite the prejudice that surrounded them. Helping Jacob, she said, was simply another chance to do what she believed was right, regardless of what other people might think. Jacob slowly removed his hand from the revolver and rested it at his side. For years, he had accepted every frightening rumor about Apache people without ever questioning whether those stories were true. Yet the woman standing before him had entered his home not to harm him, but to clean, cook, and make sure a weary stranger would not spend another hungry night alone. Confused by emotions he could not explain, Jacob quietly thanked Ayanna. As the warm scent of fresh stew filled the cabin once more, he realized that perhaps the greatest surprise waiting inside his home was not the unexpected visitor, but the possibility that everything he believed about his neighbors had been wrong. Jacob thanked Ayanna for everything she had done, but his pride would not allow him to accept her kindness so easily. Looking at the clean cabin and the warm meal on the table, he quietly said, "You didn't have to do all this. I can take care of myself." Ayanna simply smiled, her calm eyes reflecting years of wisdom earned through hardship. "A strong man also knows when to accept kindness," she replied gently. Those words were spoken without judgment or pride, yet they settled deeply into Jacob's heart. Before he could say another word, she wished him a peaceful evening and disappeared into the fading Montana sunset. That night, Jacob could hardly sleep. The fire crackled softly inside the cabin, while the wind whispered through the pine trees outside. He kept replaying every moment of their conversation in his mind. The stories he had heard about Apache people described them as dangerous enemies, yet nothing about. Ayanna matched those tales. She had entered his home without taking a single possession. Instead, she had left behind food, warmth, and order. For the first time in years, Jacob questioned whether fear and prejudice had blinded him from seeing the truth about the people who lived only a few miles away. At sunrise, Jacob stepped outside carrying a cup of hot coffee. The cool mountain air refreshed his tired body as he noticed fresh horse tracks leading away from his cabin toward the northern hills. Curiosity overcame him. Saddling his horse, he followed the tracks through narrow trails lined with tall pine trees and open grasslands. After nearly an hour, he reached a weathered wooden fence that divided grazing land between local ranchers and the nearby Apache settlement. Several broken posts leaned toward the ground, allowing cattle and horses to wander freely between the properties. Jacob dismounted quietly and watched from a distance. Ayanna was already there, lifting heavy fence rails into place without asking anyone for help. Her horse stood nearby while she carefully tied fresh rope around the damaged posts. She wasn't repairing only the section that protected Apache horses. She was rebuilding the entire fence, including the part that kept Jacob's cattle from wandering into dangerous mountain terrain. She worked with patience and determination, never stopping to complain about the weight of the timber or the heat of the rising sun. Jacob realized she expected nothing in return for her hard work. Without saying a word, Jacob picked up a spare hammer lying in the grass and walked beside her. Ayanna looked up with a gentle smile but said nothing. Together they replaced broken posts, tightened wire, and carried heavy logs until the damaged fence stood stronger than before. As they worked, conversation came naturally. Jacob learned that Ayanna had lost her husband many years earlier during a violent conflict between armed raiders and members of her tribe. Since then, she had chosen not to live with bitterness. Instead, she believed every act of kindness could slowly heal wounds left by years of hatred and misunderstanding. Listening to her story filled Jacob with quiet shame. He remembered repeating careless rumors about Apache families without ever speaking to one of them. Ayanna never criticized him for those beliefs. She simply answered his questions honestly and shared stories of her people hunting, raising children, caring for elders, and respecting the land they called home. Jacob discovered their hopes and struggles were no different from those of ranching families across Montana. They all wanted safety, honest work, and peaceful lives. The wall of suspicion inside Jacob's heart slowly began to crumble with every word they exchanged. By the time the sun settled behind the Rocky Mountains, the fence was fully repaired and stretched proudly across the valley. Jacob looked over the peaceful land where cattle grazed beside Apache horses without conflict. Turning toward Ayanna, he realized she had brought far more than a warm meal into his lonely life. Her courage, compassion, and quiet strength had challenged years of fear and misunderstanding. As they rode back toward their separate homes beneath the golden evening sky, Jacob understood that this unexpected friendship was only the beginning. Sometimes the greatest changes in a man's life begin with one simple act of kindness from a stranger.